Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Leave it in the comments where you are watching from, because today we will travel together to the dark mountains of Missouri in the year 1882. Imagine for a moment the dense forests of the Ozarks during the fall of that year. The golden leaves fell silently on trails that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. In this mountainous region of southwestern Missouri, where cold October winds cut through the skin like sharp blades, small rural communities lived isolated from one another, connected only by dirt roads that wound between deep valleys and hills covered with centuries-old oak trees. Webster County in those days was a territory where civilization was still struggling to establish itself. The railway had only recently arrived, bringing with it a mixture of hope and mistrust among local residents. Families who had moved to the region in search of cheap land and a fresh start quickly discovered that the Ozarks held more than picturesque landscapes. There was something in the shadows of those mountains that seemed to watch every movement, every breath, every secret whispered in the wind. It was against this backdrop that Elizabeth Fairmont arrived in the small town of Marshfield in the second week of October. A 27-year-old woman with carefully combed brown hair and eyes that reflected an unusual determination for the time. Elizabeth Fairmont was an ordinary pioneer. Coming from Boston, she carried with her not only two well-kept leather suitcases, but also a purpose that she kept an absolute secret. Records from the Ozark Hotel discovered decades later in county archives show that she registered under the name Elizabeth F. Fairmont, with her occupation listed as teacher. But there was something about her poise, the way she avoided prolonged conversations, and the way her eyes scanned every corner of the small town that suggested that teaching children wasn't exactly what had brought her to those isolated mountains. The hotel's owner, a man named Thomas Whitaker, later described Elizabeth Fairmont as a lady of refined manners, but with an air of urgency that she could not conceal. She paid for a week's lodging with gold coins, which was unusual for the region. Most visitors paid with paper money, or more often with barter goods. For the first 3 days, Elizabeth Fairmont followed a meticulous routine. She would wake up before dawn, have a simple coffee in the hotel dining room, and go for long walks along the trails that wound through the hills. Locals began to notice her presence, mainly because she always carried a small leather notebook where she constantly wrote something down. When asked about her notes, she politely replied that she was documenting the local flora for a botanical study. But Elizabeth Fairmont was not alone in Marshfield. 3 men had arrived in the city 2 days before her, staying at a boarding house across the main street. Men who did not fit the typical profile of visitors to the Ozarks. They wore city clothes, had hands too soft to be farmers or lumberjacks, and spoke with accents that did not belong in Missouri. The local sheriff, a Civil War veteran named Abraham Hayes, had noticed the temporal coincidence of the arrivals. In his personal notes, found more than a century later in a forgotten box in the basement of City Hall, Hayes wrote, "There is something strange going on in our city. The Boston woman asks too many questions about the old abandoned lead mines, and the 3 outsiders seem to be waiting for something. The lead mines of the Ozarks had been exploited since colonial times, leaving behind an underground labyrinth of tunnels and chambers that stretched for miles below the surface. Many of these mines were abandoned after the war as lead prices plummeted and miners left in search of opportunities in the big cities. What was left behind was a network of dark passages that few dared to explore. Elizabeth Fairmont, however, seemed fascinated by these abandoned structures. During her walks, she was often seen near the sealed entrances of the old mines, always with her notebook in hand, always jotting down something that no one else could understand. The 3 mysterious men, in turn, had been seen following the same trails, always keeping a respectful distance, but never losing sight of Elizabeth Fairmont. On Thursday, October 17th, something changed in the atmosphere of Little Marshfield. Elizabeth Fairmont didn't come down for breakfast as usual. Thomas Whitaker, worried about the absence of his most punctual guest, went upstairs to her room about 9:01 in the morning. The door was unlocked, the room impeccably tidy, as if she had just left for a morning walk. Her bags were in place, her clothes neatly folded in the closet, but Elizabeth Fairmont had disappeared. The disappearance of Elizabeth Fairmont created an atmosphere of tension that hung over Marshfield like morning mist in the valleys of the Ozarks. Thomas Whitaker, still holding her room key, stood on the doorstep for long minutes, as if waiting for her to emerge from behind the curtains with a perfectly logical explanation for her absence. But there was no logical explanation for what he found in the room. Elizabeth Fairmont's clothes were all there, neatly folded. Her jewelry, including a pearl necklace she wore daily, remained on the dressing table. Even her hiking boots were lined up at the foot of the bed, as if she had prepared herself for normal sleep. What disturbed Whitaker most was the total absence of signs of struggle or haste. Everything was in its place except Elizabeth Fairmont. The only object missing was the small leather notebook she carried constantly. That same notebook where she wrote down her observations about the local flora. Whitaker had seen Elizabeth Fairmont writing on it the night before over dinner, her hands moving quickly over the yellowed pages, while her eyes remained alert, watching her every move in the hotel's dining room. Sheriff Abraham Hayes was called immediately, a man of 52 with gray hair and a scar that cut through his left forehead, a reminder of the Battle of Wilson Creek. Hayes had seen too many things during the war to be easily frightened, but he later confessed in his diaries that Elizabeth Fairmont's room caused him inexplicable discomfort. "There's something wrong here," Hayes muttered as he methodically examined every corner of the room. A woman doesn't just disappear, leaving her most valuable belongings behind, especially not a woman like her, who seemed to calculate every move. The first searches began even before noon. Hayes organized groups of locals to scour the trails that Elizabeth Fairmont used to walk. Men knew those mountains like the back of their hands, every stone, every striking tree, every dangerous bend in the steep paths. If she had been in an accident or got lost, they would find her quickly, but the hours passed without any sign of Elizabeth Fairmont. No fresh footprints on the muddy trails, no pieces of fabric stuck in the low branches, no indication that she had left the hotel in the morning. It was as if it had simply dissolved into the thin mountain air. During the search, Hayes made a discovery that would completely change the nature of the investigation. The three mysterious men who had arrived 2 days before Elizabeth Fairmont had also disappeared. The pension where they were staying reported that they did not return the night before. Her rooms, like Elizabeth Fairmont's, were tidy, and with all her belongings in place. "This is no coincidence," Hayes wrote in his diary that night. 4 people do not disappear simultaneously from a small town without a trace. There's something deeper going on here, something our small community may not be prepared to face. The investigation took on a new dimension when Mary Patterson, a widow who lived in the house closest to the old Lyd mines, came to the sheriff with disturbing information. Mary had woken up in the early hours of Thursday to the sound of voices coming from the direction of the abandoned mines, whispering voices that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth. "I couldn't understand what they were saying," Mary reported in a trembling voice, "but there were at least 4 people talking downstairs. I thought about waking up my neighbor, but the sound stopped before I could make up my mind. Now, I regret not having done anything." Hayes decided to personally examine the entrances to the old mines. What he found there made him deeply uneasy. One of the entrances that had been sealed with wooden planks years earlier was now partially open. The planks had been carefully removed and stacked next to the opening, as if someone had planned to return to put them back in place. Even more disturbing was what Hayes found near the entrance to the mine. Fresh footprints in the damp earth, heavy men's boot footprints, and among them the distinctive marks of delicate women's shoes. shoes that could perfectly well belong to a Boston teacher named Elizabeth Fairmont. The sheriff knew that going down alone into that mine would be unwise. The ancient excavations were known for their deep pits, accumulated toxic gases, and unstable structures that could collapse at any moment. But the footprints were clearly headed inland from the mountain, disappearing into the absolute darkness of the underground tunnels. That evening, Hayes organized a search expedition to explore the mines. The next day, 5 brave men volunteered, including James Morrison, a former miner who knew the underground labyrinths of the Ozarks better than anyone. Morrison had worked in these mines for 15 years before they were abandoned, and if there was anyone who could safely navigate the dark passages, it was him. These mines go deeper than most people realize, Morrison explained to the group gathered at the police station. There are tunnels that stretch for miles, natural chambers large enough to house an entire church, and shafts that seem to have no bottom. If these people went in there, we're going to need a lot of luck to find them alive. As preparations for the underground expedition continued, Hayes received an unexpected visitor. A telegraph operator arrived from Springfield with an urgent message addressed to the Marshfield sheriff. The message came from Boston, Massachusetts, and carried information that would completely transform Hayes's perception of who Elizabeth Fairmont really was. The message was brief, but devastating in its implications. Elizabeth Fairmont is not a teacher. It is a private detective hired by Boston family to investigate Brother Charles Fairmont's disappearance, occurred in Missouri Ozarks last September. Exercise extreme caution. Case may involve organized criminal activity. The Boston telegram fell from the trembling hands of Sheriff Hayes like a dry leaf in the autumn wind of the Ozarks. Elizabeth Fairmont was not a simple teacher, fascinated by local botany. She was an experienced investigator, following in the footsteps of her own brother, who had disappeared just a month earlier. Suddenly, his insistent questions about the abandoned mines, his solitary walks, and that mysterious notebook took on a completely different meaning. Charles Fairmont had disappeared in September. According to the cable, this meant that Elizabeth Fairmont had arrived in the Ozarks already knowing that something terrible could have happened to him in this same region. She wasn't documenting Flora. I was documenting evidence. Each note in her leather notebook probably contained clues she had collected about Charles's whereabouts, information that had now disappeared along with her. Hayes called an emergency meeting with the men who would take part in the mine expedition. In the flickering light of the flashlights at the police station, he read the telegram aloud, noting the expressions of surprise and concern that were drawn on faces tanned by years of hard work in the mountains. "It changes everything," said James Morrison, the former miner. "If there is a criminal organization operating in our mountains, these mines could be much more dangerous than we imagined. We're not just talking about unstable tunnels and toxic gases. We may be heading straight for an ambush." But Hayes knew they had no choice. Elizabeth Fairmont and the 3 mysterious men were down there in the depths of the ancient excavations. If they were still alive, each hour that passed diminished their chances of survival. If they were dead, the evidence of what really happened to them could disappear forever in that underground labyrinth. On the morning of Saturday, October 19th, the rescue expedition descended for the first time on the abandoned mines of the Ozarks. 6 men carrying flashlights, ropes, digging tools, and weapons. The air below was heavy and humid, impregnated with the metallic smell characteristic of old mining operations. Their voices echoed strangely in the narrow passageways, creating a ghostly chorus that seemed to come from all directions at once. Morrison guided the group through the main tunnels, following a mental map built over decades of underground work. The footprints Hayes had discovered at the entrance became more difficult to track as they made their way through the rocky corridors. But there were other signs of recent passage: melted candle marks on the walls, small fragments of fabric stuck in rocky ledges, and something that made Hayes's blood run cold: dark stains on the floor that could be dried blood. "This way," Morrison whispered, pointing to a fork that led to even deeper levels of the mine. "These marks take us to the old chambers, places where we used to extract the richest veins of lead, but they are also the most dangerous places. Some of these tunnels have not been adequately reinforced." As they descended deeper into the bowels of the mountain, the men began to hear something that made them stop instantly. It was a low, steady sound, like a whispering conversation from the depths. Human voices echoed through the rocky passages, but distorted by the peculiar acoustics of the tunnels, so that it became impossible to distinguish words, or even determine how many people were speaking. Hayes signaled for everyone to remain absolutely silent. Slowly, with the lanterns partially covered to reduce their luminosity, the group advanced in the direction of the sounds. The tunnel gradually widened until it opened into an impressive natural chamber with a high ceiling lost in the darkness and walls covered with rock formations that glowed faintly in the light of the lanterns. And it was in this chamber that they made the first macabre discovery of the expedition. In the center of the space, there were the remains of a recent bonfire. Around the campfire, personal belongings were scattered as if they had been abandoned in a hurry. A men's leather wallet, a pocket watch stopped at the time of 3 hours and 45 minutes, and something that made Hayes's heart race. Elizabeth Fairmont's small leather notebook opened to a page covered in her careful handwriting. Morrison cautiously approached the notebook and read Elizabeth Fairmont's last notes in a low voice. "I have found evidence that Charles was right. The operation is much larger than we suspected. They are using the mines as a depot for something that arrived by train last week. Heavy boxes stored in the deepest chambers. The 3 men from Chicago are not just observers. They are part of the organization." The last entry in the notebook was dated Thursday, October 17th, written apparently just before Elizabeth Fairmont disappeared. "They know I'm here. I discovered too much. If something happens to me, look in the Stone Eagle's chamber. Charles left a message there before they took him." Hayes looked at Morrison with increasing urgency. "Do you know where this chamber of the Stone Eagle is?" The former miner nodded gravely. "I know. It's one of the deepest formations in the mine. At least 500 men below where we are now. But to get there, we will have to go through tunnels that were partially flooded last spring. It is a treacherous path, even for those who know these passages well." As Hayes absorbed this information, one of the expedition men made an even more disturbing discovery. Near the opposite wall of the chamber, marks on the rocky ground that looked like they were made by something heavy being dragged. Marks that headed for a side tunnel that descended at a steep angle into the darker depths of the mine. And next to the drag marks, small drops of something dark that had dried on the stone. Blood that told a story that neither of them wanted to fully imagine. The dried blood marks on the rock told a silent and terrifying story. Hayes carefully examined every drop, every dark spot that peppered the floor of the chamber, like the withered petals of a sinister flower. The pattern of the stains suggested that someone had been wounded there, but not mortally. There was enough blood to indicate violence, but not enough to suggest immediate death. Morrison pointed to the side tunnel, where the drag marks disappeared into the darkness. That particular pass was known among ancient miners as the Devil's Descent, a steep tunnel that plunged into the mountain's most treacherous depths. During the years of operation of the mine, 3 workers had lost their lives in that section, victims of collapses and poisonous gases that accumulated in the lower chambers. The expedition had to make a difficult decision. Continuing to follow the drag marks meant venturing into underground territories, where your chances of survival decreased dramatically with each meter of descent. But to return to the surface with no answers meant abandoning Elizabeth Fairmont and any hope of finding out what had really happened to Charles Fairmont a month earlier. Hayes took the lead and guided the group down the steep descent. The air became thinner and more loaded with moisture as they advanced. The walls of the tunnel seemed to press against them, as if the mountain itself was trying to drive them out of their bowels. The sound of their heavy breaths echoed unsettlingly, blending with the constant drip of water seeping through the fissures in the rock. After 40 minutes of cautious descent, they reached a section of the mine that Morrison did not fully recognize. The passages had been artificially expanded, with evident signs of recent excavation work. Someone had been using these deep chambers for purposes that had nothing to do with traditional lead mining. It was at this deep air that they found the first concrete evidence of the operation that Elizabeth Fairmont had discovered. A series of wooden boxes stacked neatly in a side chamber, each marked with strange symbols that neither man could decipher. The boxes were too heavy to be moved by a single person, confirming suspicions that a well-structured organization was operating in those depths. Hayes forced open one of the smaller boxes and found something that completely transformed his understanding of the case. Inside, neatly wrapped in waxed cloth, were documents, maps, and photographs that clearly did not belong to a legitimate mining operation. They were detailed plans for rail routes, freight train schedules, and lists of valuable shipments that passed through the Ozarks during the fall. The photographs were even more revealing. Images of armed men strategically positioned along the railway lines, with handwritten notes indicating vulnerable points where a train could be stopped and looted with maximum efficiency. The operation that Elizabeth Fairmont had uncovered was not just an ordinary criminal hideout. It was the planning center of an organization of train robbers who used the abandoned mines as a secret base for their activities. Among the documents, Hayes found something that made him understand the true extent of the danger that Elizabeth Fairmont had faced. A detailed list of people who had asked questions about suspicious activity in the region during the past few months. Charles Fairmont's name was at the top of the list, marked with an ominous note that simply reads, "Solved." Just below in fresher inkon was Elizabeth Fairmont's name, followed by the date of October 17th and the word "captured." The discovery confirmed Hayes's worst fears. Elizabeth Fairmont was alive when she was taken to the depths of the mine, but her situation was desperate. The criminal organization operating in the underground chambers had already eliminated her brother Charles, and now she had become an inconvenient witness who knew too much about their operations. Morrison discovered something equally disturbing in an adjacent chamber, evidence that that place had been used as a temporary prison. Chains attached to the rock walls, food scraps strewn across the floor, and even more gruesome, bloodstains on the stones that suggested violent interrogations had taken place there on a regular basis. The drag marks that had followed from the upper chamber continued through the lower passages, leading to even deeper tunnels that branched out in multiple directions like veins in a gigantic subterranean body. Each path represented a choice that could mean the difference between finding Elizabeth Fairmont alive or discovering only more evidence of her death. As the expedition paused to decide which direction to go, a distant sound echoed through the tunnels. It was the unmistakable noise of metal against stone, as if someone was using tools or weapons in the remotest depths of the mine. The sound came from somewhere far below, where they were in the most dangerous sections of the underground complex, where the former miners rarely ventured even during the years of active operation. Hayes checked his pocket watch. They had already spent 4 hours underground, and their flashlights were beginning to show signs that the fuel was running out. They had enough fuel for perhaps 2 more hours of exploration before being forced to return to the surface in total darkness. Every minute they spent in the depths increased not only the risk to their own lives, but also decreased the chances that Elizabeth Fairmont would still be alive when they finally found her. The metallic sound echoed again through the passageways, closer this time, coming from a specific direction that led to tunnels that Morrison vaguely remembered from his years working in the mine. Tunnels leading to the chamber of the Stone Eagle that Elizabeth Fairmont had mentioned in her last notes. The chamber where Charles Fairmont had allegedly left a message before he was captured by his captives. The journey to the Stone Eagle's chamber took the expedition through passages that seemed to have been forgotten by time. Morrison guided the group through tunnels so narrow they had to walk in single file, their lanterns casting dancing shadows on the rock walls that writhed like restless spirits. The air became heavier with each step, loaded with moisture from groundwater that had seeped into the lower sections of the mine during decades of neglect. The metallic sound they had heard earlier was not repeated, leaving only the echo of their own footsteps and the constant dripping of water that pulled in dark puddles along the way. Hayes began to question whether they had really heard human activity, or if it was just the mountain adjusting, creating noises that their anxious minds interpreted as signs of life. After 2 hours of navigating through the underground labyrinths, they finally reached the chamber of the Stone Eagle. The name proved perfectly appropriate when his flashlights illuminated a natural rock formation on the cave's ceiling that remarkably resembled the silhouette of an eagle with outstretched wings. The chamber was wider than any space they had previously encountered, with multiple passages branching out in all directions, like the fingers of a gigantic hand buried in the rock. Morrison pointed to a particular section of the wall where there were evident signs of recent activity. Someone had used tools to dig a small opening in the rock, creating a natural hiding place. Hayes approached carefully and discovered what Elizabeth Fairmont had hoped to find, a message left by Charles Fairmont. The message was engraved directly on the stone with the tip of a knife or similar tool. The lettering was irregular, clearly done by someone working in the darkness or under extreme pressure. Charles had written September 23rd. I discovered the main deposit. Serpent Tunnel 400 paces to the east. They know I'm here. If something happens, look for the names on the documents. Boston needs to know. Below the main message, there was something even more disturbing. A second message. This one with different and clearly more recent handwriting. Elizabeth, if you find this, don't go down anymore. They have me. Escape while you can. CF. The discovery confirmed that Charles Fairmont had survived long enough after his capture to try to warn his sister. But the presence of a second message also meant that Elizabeth Fairmont had made it to that chamber before she was captured. She had followed the clues left by her brother, discovered his warning message, but still continued her investigation until she was caught by the same organization that had eliminated Charles. Hayes carefully examined the area around the message and found evidence that confirmed his suspicions. Feminine footprints in the damp dirt of the floor, small fragments of blue fabric that matched the description of the dress Elizabeth Fairmont wore on the last day she was seen at the hotel, and something more sinister, drops of fresh blood that had not yet completely dried. The serpent tunnel mentioned in Charles's message was in a section of the mine that Morrison knew only from hearsay. It was a natural passage that snaked through the solid rock, following veins of underground water that had carved their way through the mountain over thousands of years. The tunnel was known for its structural instability and the occasional presence of toxic gases that accumulated in its lower sections. The expedition followed the directions left by Charles, carefully counting the steps in the easterly direction. The Serpent's Tunnel turned out to be even more treacherous than Morrison had imagined. The walls were uneven and slippery, forcing men to constantly lean on each other to avoid slips that could result in falls into deep fissures that opened up in the rocky floor. 400 paces led them to a fork in the road, where the tunnel split in 3 different directions. Hayes stopped to examine the ground for clues as to which way to go when one of the men on the expedition made a macabre discovery. Leaning against the rock wall, partially hidden by a natural ledge, was the body of a man wearing clothing that clearly did not belong to a local miner. The body was in a state of advanced decomposition, but it was still possible to determine that death had occurred approximately a month earlier. The dead man's clothing was of superior quality, the kind of clothing that an educated Boston man might wear during a trip west. More importantly, in the coat pockets, they found identification documents that confirmed their worst suspicions. Charles Fairmont had been found. The cause of death was not immediately apparent, but there were evident signs of violence. The clothes were torn in several places. There were dark stains that could be dried blood, and the position of the body suggested that he had been dragged to that spot and abandoned. Even more disturbingly, the pockets had been rummaged through, and anything of value had been removed. Hayes found something that Charles had managed to hide before he died. Sewn into the inner lining of his coat was a small folded sheet of paper containing names and numbers that clearly referred to the criminal organization operating in the mines. The list included names of people in far-flung cities like Chicago and St. Louis, monetary values that suggested significant financial transactions, and dates that corresponded to train robberies that had occurred in the region during the previous months. Most shocking of all was the last entry on Charles's list, a future date, October 25th, just 6 days after the discovery of his body. The entry indicated a specific target: the Missouri Pacific freight train that would transport a shipment of gold from the Colorado mines through the Ozarks on its way to St. Louis. The criminal organization had not only eliminated Charles and captured Elizabeth Fairmont, they were preparing to execute the biggest heist of their operation, using the information they had tortured to extract from their victims. Elizabeth Fairmont was not just an inconvenient investigator. She possessed knowledge about her family's operation in Boston that could be valuable for criminals to plan future attacks. The discovery of Charles Fairmont's body transformed the urgent nature of the expedition into something much darker. Hayes knew that Elizabeth Fairmont now faced the same fate that had befallen her brother. But there was one crucial difference. She possessed information that criminals considered too valuable to waste immediately. This meant that she could still be alive, being held captive somewhere in the labyrinthine depths of the mine. Morrison examined the 3 passages that opened before them at the fork. Each tunnel disappeared into absolute darkness, offering few clues as to which direction might lead to the criminal organization's main hideout. But there was one detail that caught his attention. One of the passages showed signs of much heavier traffic than the others. The floor was more compacted. There were rope marks on the walls where heavy loads had been dragged, and the air carried a peculiar odor of tobacco smoke and human sweat. The expedition followed this passage for nearly an hour, gradually descending through tunnels that had been clearly modified to accommodate regular movement of people and equipment. At several points, they found evidence that the route was often used. Remnants of burnt candles fixed in cracks in the walls, small supply depots hidden in natural loves, and even an area where someone had built a rudimentary bridge over a deep well using stolen wooden planks. It was in this deepest section of the mine that Hayes made a discovery that made him understand the true scale of the criminal operation. A natural chamber had been converted into an elaborate underground complex, complete with separate areas for different activities. There was a section that clearly served as an armory, with boxes of ammunition and guns stacked against the rock walls. Another area had been turned into a planning site, with maps hanging and makeshift tables where documents were scattered. Even more disturbing was a section that had been converted into a makeshift prison. Chains and handcuffs were attached to the walls. There were dark stains on the floor that suggested violent interrogations, and scattered food scraps indicated that prisoners had been held there for prolonged periods. The smell of the place was nauseating, a mixture of fear, violence, and human despair that had impregnated itself in the rock itself. Hayes carefully examined the prison area for signs that Elizabeth Fairmont had been held there. Among the debris on the floor, she found a mother-of-pearl button that exactly matched the buttons on the dress she was wearing when she disappeared. Next to the bud were strands of brown hair tied into one of the chains, hair that had the same color and texture that witnesses had described when talking about Elizabeth Fairmont. But the prison area was empty. Whatever had happened to Elizabeth Fairmont, she was no longer being kept in that section of the mine. Hayes began to fear that she had suffered the same fate as Charles. But there was something that didn't quite fit into this theory. If she was dead, why remove the body from that area? Charles had been abandoned where he had been killed, his usefulness exhausted by the time of his death. Morrison discovered something in the maps scattered in the planning area that provided a possible answer. Among the documents was a detailed plan for the assault on the cargo train planned for October 25th. The plan included not only the route of the attack and positions of the assailants, but also contingencies for dealing with witnesses and a specific section on how to use the Boston prisoner to obtain information on valuables transport routes in the East. Elizabeth Fairmont had not been killed immediately because the criminals discovered that she possessed valuable knowledge about financial operations that extended far beyond the Ozarks. His family in Boston was involved in businesses that included transportation of valuables, trade routes, and shipping schedules that could be exploited by the criminal organization in future operations. The documentation found revealed that the organization was much more sophisticated than a simple gang of train robbers. They corresponded with criminals in various cities, coordinated raids in multiple states, and had developed a network of informants that allowed them to anticipate movements of valuable cargo with impressive accuracy. Among the papers was also evidence that they knew about the Fairmont brothers' investigation long before Charles arrived at the Ozarks, intercepted letters, copied telegrams, and even reports from people who had been bribed in Boston to monitor the activities of the Fairmont family. The organization had allowed Charles to come to Missouri because they wanted to find out exactly what he knew and who else was involved in the investigation. Hayes found a particularly revealing letter that had been written just 2 days earlier. The letter was addressed to someone in Chicago and detailed plans to move the valuable merchandise to a safer location before the planned robbery. The letter clearly referred to Elizabeth Fairmont, indicating that she would be moved to another hideout, where she could be interrogated more efficiently about information she possessed about financial operations in the East. The site mentioned in the letter was described as the Underground Cathedral, a reference Morrison immediately recognized. It was a natural chamber located in the deepest sections of the mine, known among ancient miners for its impressive dimensions and rock formations that resembled the columns of a Gothic cathedral. The site was at least another hour's walk through particularly dangerous tunnels, but it was the perfect hiding place for an organization that needed to keep prisoners away from any possibility of rescue. The expedition now faced its most crucial decision. Their lanterns were nearly out of fuel. They had been underground for more than 6 hours, and they were venturing into sections of the mine where even Morrison was unsure about structural stability. But Elizabeth Fairmont was alive. She was being kept in the underground cathedral, and every hour that passed increased the likelihood that she would be killed as soon as her captors extracted all the useful information she had. Hayes made the decision to continue. They had come too far and discovered too much to abandon Elizabeth Fairmont in the hands of the criminals who had already murdered Charles. The journey to the underground cathedral took the expedition through the most dangerous tunnels they had ever faced. Morrison guided the group through passages where the roof had partially collapsed, creating rocky obstacles that had to be circumvented with extreme care. The air became thinner with each step, laden with gases that made the men cough and feel occasional dizziness that forced them to stop frequently to regain their balance. The lanterns began to fail one by one, their flames dwindling until they became just faint points of light that they could barely illuminate a few feet ahead. Hayes distributed the last reserves of fuel among the remaining lanterns, knowing that they had perhaps 40 minutes of light before they were forced to sail into the absolute darkness of the subterranean depths. It was during one of these forced pauses that they heard again the sound that had intrigued them earlier. Human voices echoing through the rocky passageways, this time clearly coming from the direction of the underground cathedral. But these voices were different from the previous ones. There was an urgency to them, a commanding tone that suggested something important was going on in the criminal organization's main hideout. Morrison recognized the proximity of the cathedral when they began to notice changes in the acoustics of the tunnels. The echoes of their footsteps became more resonant, indicating that they were approaching a much larger space. The air also changed, becoming cooler and loaded with a different humidity that suggested the presence of moving groundwater. Finally, after another 30 minutes of careful navigation, they came to an opening that led to the underground cathedral. The spectacle that opened before his dim lanterns was simultaneously impressive and terrifying. The natural chamber was huge, with a ceiling that disappeared into the darkness above their heads, and rock formations that truly resembled the columns of an ancient Gothic cathedral. But the cathedral was not empty. In the center of the chamber, lit by multiple fires that cast dancing shadows on the rock walls, was a criminal operation in full swing. At least a dozen men moved through space, organizing equipment, checking weapons, and preparing supplies for what was clearly going to be an important expedition, and tied to one of the rock formations that served as natural columns. Hayes finally spotted Elizabeth Fairmont. Even from a distance and in the irregular light of the fires, it was possible to see that she had been mistreated during her captivity. His clothes were torn, his hair unkempt, and his posture suggested physical and emotional exhaustion. But she was alive, and more importantly, seemed to be aware and alert to what was happening around her. The position of the rescue expedition was both advantageous and dangerous. They were in a natural gallery that offered a clear view of the cathedral, but were completely exposed if they were discovered. There was only one entrance and exit of the gallery where they were located, which meant that they would be cornered if the criminals noticed their presence. Hayes carefully observed the activity below and began to understand what he was witnessing. The criminals were preparing to leave the cathedral, probably to execute the train robbery planned for October 25th. Boxes of ammunition were being loaded, horses were being prepared in a section of the chamber that Hayes had not initially noticed, and maps were being distributed among the men. Elizabeth Fairmont was being prepared to be moved as well. Two of the criminals approached her with additional ropes, clearly planning to transport her to another location. Hayes realized that this might be his only opportunity to attempt a rescue. Once Elizabeth Fairmont was removed from the cathedral, finding her again would be virtually impossible in the underground labyrinth of the mines. The rescue expedition faced devastating odds. 6 men armed with hunting guns against 12 experienced criminals equipped with military-grade rifles and pistols. The element of surprise would be their only advantage, and even then, only if they managed to coordinate an attack that neutralized several of the criminals simultaneously. Morrison pointed to a specific section of the cathedral where several boxes of ammunition were stacked next to one of the main fires. If they managed to cause an explosion in that area, they could create enough confusion to try to reach Elizabeth Fairmont. But the plan would require someone to descend into the cathedral and get dangerously close to the ammunition, risking not only their own life, but also the possibility of causing a collapse that could kill everyone in the chamber. While Hayes considered his options limited, something happened that completely changed the situation. Elizabeth Fairmont, who had remained seemingly passive during her observation, suddenly moved with movements that suggested she had been pretending to be weaker than she really was. She managed to partially loosen the ropes that bound her to the rock formation. The criminals did not immediately notice Elizabeth Fairmont's escape attempt. They were too focused on their preparations for the planned robbery, but Hayes knew it was only a matter of minutes before someone noticed she was breaking free. If she managed to break free completely, she could try to escape. But where? The cathedral had multiple exits, but most led to tunnels she didn't know about, and where she could easily get lost in the depths of the mountain. Hayes made a decision that would change the course of events. Instead of attempting a direct assault against impossible odds, he decided to create a distraction that would give Elizabeth Fairmont a chance to escape, while simultaneously alerting her to the presence of the rescue expedition. It was a risky plan that could result in everyone's death, but it was the only strategy that offered any hope of success. The sheriff instructed his men on what they needed to do. Each would choose a specific target among the criminals. At Hayes' signal, everyone would shoot simultaneously, creating as much confusion as possible. Morrison would be in charge of trying to cause the explosion in the ammunition area, while Hayes would try to reach Elizabeth Fairmont during the chaos that would follow. The moment of attack came when Elizabeth Fairmont was finally able to free herself from the ropes that bound her. She moved with an agility that surprised both her captives and the rescue expedition, rolling quickly behind one of the larger rock formations to protect herself. The criminals noticed their escape almost immediately, and cries of alarm echoed through the underground cathedral like the roars of angry beasts. Hayes gave the signal. 6 rifles fired simultaneously from the gallery where the expedition was stationed. The sound of gunfire reverberated through the natural chamber with a deafening intensity, amplified by the peculiar acoustics of the rock formations. 3 of the criminals immediately fell, hit by the projectiles that cut through the smoke-laden atmosphere of the bonfires. The chaos that ensued was instantaneous and absolute. The remaining criminals fanned out for cover, some returning fire in the direction of the gallery, others trying to locate Elizabeth Fairmont in her new position. Morrison took advantage of the confusion to quickly descend to the cathedral level, moving through the shadows like a ghost, familiar with every irregularity of the rock. Elizabeth Fairmont demonstrated a remarkable presence of mind during the shooting. Instead of trying to flee immediately, she remained protected behind the rock formation and began to carefully observe the movements of the criminals. His days of captivity had given him intimate knowledge about the organization of men and their routines, information that now became crucial to his survival. Morrison reached the area where the ammunition boxes were stacked next to the main campfire, with precise movements born of years of experience in hazardous environments. He dropped one of the torches directly onto the boxes. The ensuing explosion was devastating, sending fragments of rock and metal flying through the cathedral like deadly hail. The explosion caused more than Hayes had anticipated. Part of the chamber's roof began to collapse, creating a shower of stones that turned the cathedral into an even more dangerous environment. Several of the bonfires were extinguished by dust and debris, drastically reducing visibility and forcing everyone present to move blindly through the chaotic environment. Hayes took advantage of the partial darkness to descend to the cathedral level. Sailing through the rubble and dodging the occasional shots that still echoed through the chamber, he headed in the direction where he had last seen Elizabeth Fairmont. The sound of his heavy breathing mingled with the groans of the wounded and the screams of the criminals who tried to reorganize their defense. He found Elizabeth Fairmont crouching behind a pile of boxes that had been knocked over by the explosion. She was wounded with a cut on her forehead that bled profusely, but her eyes showed a determination that had not been broken by the days of captivity. When she saw Hayes approaching, she initially retreated, not immediately recognizing that he was there to save her. Hayes was able to quickly communicate her identity as Sheriff of Marshfield and explained that there was a rescue expedition trying to get her out. Elizabeth Fairmont immediately began providing crucial information about the criminal organization. She revealed that there were at least 20 men in total, that many of them had already left for positions along the train route, and that the leader of the organization was a man known only as Colonel, who maintained regular correspondence with criminals in Chicago. More importantly, Elizabeth Fairmont had discovered during her captivity that the organization planned to use the information extracted from her to execute a series of robberies in the East, including banks in Boston, where her family kept accounts. The train robbery was only the first step in a much larger operation that would span several states. While Hayes and Elizabeth Fairmont had a brief conversation, Morrison had managed to locate an alternative escape route. During the explosion, debris had revealed a natural passage that had been hidden behind one of the cathedral's walls. The passage seemed to lead upwards, possibly connecting with tunnels that could take them back to the surface without having to pass through the remaining criminals. But escaping the cathedral would only be the first challenge. Elizabeth Fairmont was clearly in a state of shock and physical exhaustion, making it unlikely that she would be able to make the grueling journey through the unstable tunnels to the surface. In addition, the criminals who had survived the attack would certainly try to pursue them and knew the mines much better than the ransom expedition. Hayes made a decision that would save not only Elizabeth Fairmont, but also prevent the assault planned for October 25th. Instead of attempting an immediate escape, he decided that the expedition should remain in the cathedral long enough to completely destroy the criminal operation. The maps, documents, and supplies accumulated there represented years of planning that, if destroyed, would paralyze the organization long enough for officials in other states to be alerted. Morrison and the other members of the expedition began systematically destroying everything they found in the cathedral. Documents were burned, maps were torn up, and supplies were scattered or destroyed. Elizabeth Fairmont, despite her weakened physical condition, insisted on helping, demonstrating detailed knowledge about which materials were most important to the criminal operation. During this frenzied activity of destruction, Elizabeth Fairmont revealed something that shocked Hayes deeply. Among the information the criminals had tried to extract from her was the whereabouts of a substantial amount of gold that Charles Fairmont had discovered and hidden somewhere in the Ozarks before he was captured. The gold did not belong to the criminals, but was part of a shipment they had stolen months earlier and which Charles had managed to secretly retrieve. The revelation about the hidden gold completely changed Hayes's perspective on the events that had unfolded in the mines of the Ozarks. Charles Fairmont had not just been a curious investigator who accidentally stumbled upon the criminal operation. He had been a man on a specific mission, trying to recover stolen gold that was worth a considerable fortune, even by the standards of the time. Elizabeth Fairmont quickly explained that Charles had uncovered evidence that the criminal organization had stolen a shipment of gold destined for banks in St. Louis earlier in the summer. The robbery had been executed with military precision, but Charles had managed to trace some of the gold to the abandoned mines of the Ozarks. He had secretly recovered a significant portion before he was discovered and captured. The place where Charles had hidden the recovered gold was known only to Elizabeth Fairmont, information that she had managed to keep secret, even during the violent interrogations of her captives. It was this information that made his life too valuable for criminals to immediately waste, but it was also what would ensure his death once they revealed the whereabouts of the hidden treasure. As the expedition continued to destroy the materials in the cathedral, Hayes began to hear sounds that indicated that more criminals were returning to the depths of the mine. Distant voices echoed through the tunnels, accompanied by the sound of heavy boots and equipment being moved quickly. The members of the organization who had left to prepare for the assault on the train were returning to investigate the sounds of gunfire and explosion that had echoed through the mountains. Morrison discovered something in the documents that were being destroyed that provided crucial information on how to escape the situation. Among the papers was a detailed map of the mines that showed not only the known tunnels, but also natural passages that had been discovered by the criminal organization during its years operating there. One of these passages led directly to a secret exit located more than 2 miles away from the main entrance to the mine. The secret exit emerged in an isolated area of the mountains, where criminals kept horses and supplies for emergency situations. If the expedition had managed to reach this exit, they would not only have escaped the mines, but they would also have had access to transportation that would allow them to reach Marshfield much more quickly than on foot through the mountain trails. Elizabeth Fairmont insisted that before they left, they needed to retrieve the gold that Charles had hidden. She argued that, without gold as evidence, it would be nearly impossible to convince authorities in other states of the true extent of the criminal operation. In addition, the recovered gold legitimately belonged to the financial institutions from which it had been stolen, and returning it would be crucial to completely dismantling the criminal network. Hayes faced an agonizing decision. Trying to recover the gold would mean more time in the dangerous mines, with armed criminals converging on you. But Elizabeth Fairmont was right about the importance of the evidence. Without concrete evidence of the operation, the criminals who survived would simply reorganize elsewhere and continue their activities. The location of the hidden gold was on the way to the secret exit. According to Elizabeth Fairmont, Charles had carefully chosen a location that would be easy to find for someone who knew the specific landmarks, but impossible to discover for those who did not possess accurate information. The gold was hidden in a small natural chamber, accessible only through a narrow fissure in the rock that required crawling for several meters. Morrison led the group through the tunnels toward the location indicated by Elizabeth Fairmont. The journey was tense, with the constant sound of criminal activity echoing through the passages behind them. The criminals had clearly discovered the destroyed cathedral and were organizing a systematic search through the tunnels. Angry voices reverberated through the rock, accompanied by shouting orders and the sound of weapons being prepared. The hiding place chosen by Charles Fairmont proved ingenious when they finally reached it. The fissure in the rock was so narrow that Hayes initially doubted that anyone could pass through it. But Elizabeth Fairmont demonstrated how her brother had discovered that it was possible to crawl through the opening into a small natural chamber on the other side. Inside the secret chamber, they found not only the gold that Charles had recovered, but also additional documents that he had collected about the criminal operation. The gold was organized in small leather bags, each marked with identifications that corresponded to the records of the banks that had been robbed. The amount was substantial enough to represent incontrovertible evidence of the crimes committed. The documents found with the gold were even more valuable than the treasure itself. Charles had been able to obtain correspondence that revealed connections between the organization of the Ozarks and criminal groups in at least 6 different states. There was evidence of bribery of public officials, lists of informants in several cities, and plans for future operations that would extend throughout the American Midwest. But recovering the gold and documents had cost precious time. As the expedition worked to transport the treasure through the narrow fissure, the sounds of the criminal search became closer and more urgent. It was clear that they had uncovered clues about the direction the expedition had taken and were rapidly approaching. Elizabeth Fairmont, despite her failing physical condition, insisted on carrying some of the gold herself. His determination to complete the mission that had cost Charles his life was evident in every move, every decision. She had survived the horrors of captivity, driven by the need to ensure that her brother's death was not in vain. Morrison consulted the stolen map and calculated that it still needed at least 2 hours to reach the secret exit. 2 hours navigating through unstable tunnels, carrying heavy gold with an exhausted woman, while being chased by criminals who knew the mines better than they did. The odds of success seemed to diminish with each passing minute. The escape through the tunnels turned into a desperate race against time and the criminals who were relentlessly approaching. Morrison guided the expedition through passages that became progressively narrower and more unstable, while the sound of pursuing boots echoed through the rocky depths like the beats of an ominous drum, marking the rhythm of a death foretold. Elizabeth Fairmont struggled to keep pace, carrying her share of the gold recovered with a determination that defied her extreme physical exhaustion. Each step was a battle against the weakness that days of captivity and psychological torture had imposed on her body. But something deeper drove her. The need to honor Charles's memory to complete the mission that had cost so much gave strength to his trembling muscles when they threatened to fail. Hayes realized that criminals were rapidly gaining ground. They knew shortcuts through the mines that allowed for faster movement, while the rescue expedition was forced to take longer, safer routes to avoid collapse and toxic gases. With each fork in the tunnels, the sound of the chasing voices became clearer, closer, more threatening. It was during a forced pause to redistribute the weight of gold that Morrison made a discovery that would change his escape strategy. The stolen map showed a series of alternative tunnels that had been dug by the criminals to create multiple escape routes. If they managed to reach one of these particular forks, they could confuse their pursuers by dividing into smaller groups that would go in different directions. The strategy was risky because it would separate the expedition, diminishing their ability to defend themselves if they were confronted directly by the criminals. But it would also multiply the chances that at least some people would reach the surface alive, carrying crucial evidence about the criminal operation. Hayes made the decision to implement the plan when they reached the next proper fork. Elizabeth Fairmont surprised everyone by suggesting a modification to the plan that demonstrated her tactical understanding of the situation. She proposed that the separate groups not only follow different routes, but also carry different parts of the evidence. If one group was captured, the other would still have enough information to expose the criminal organization. It was a strategy born of desperation, but one that realistically recognized its limited chances of survival. The fork came after another 40 minutes of movement through tunnels that seemed to tighten around them like gigantic fists trying to crush them. Morrison and 2 other men would follow with most of the gold by the most direct route to the secret exit. Hayes, Elizabeth Fairmont, and the remaining 2 men would take the most important documents via an alternate route that was longer but potentially safer. The moment of separation was charged with silent tension. Each man knew that it might be the last time he would see the others alive. Morrison briefly shook Hayes's hand, a simple gesture that carried the weight of years of friendship and mutual trust. Elizabeth Fairmont distributed the most crucial documents between the 2 groups, her hands shaking slightly as she handled the papers that represented so much pain and sacrifice. Hayes' group began their journey through the alternate route, navigating tunnels that Morrison had marked on the map as possibly unstable. The sound of the pursuers became confused and distant as the 2 routes separated, creating multiple echoes that made it difficult to determine how many criminals were following which path. It was exactly the mess Hayes had hoped to create. Elizabeth Fairmont revealed during the walk additional information about the organization she had observed during her captivity. The leader known as Colonel was not just a common criminal, but a Civil War veteran who had defected and organized a network of other disillusioned veterans. They operated with military discipline and coordination that explained the sophistication of their criminal operations. Even more disturbing, Elizabeth Fairmont had discovered that the organization had contacts with corrupt officials in several cities. Sheriffs, judges, and even federal officers were paid regularly to ignore evidence or provide information about investigations. This meant that even after escaping the mines, they could not automatically trust the local authorities. The alternate tunnel they were following began to show signs of structural instability that warranted Morrison's worried annotations on the map. Small stones occasionally fell from the ceiling, creating a constant drumming that masked other sounds. Hayes began to worry that the combined weight of 4 people might be enough to cause a larger collapse. It was then that they heard something that made them stop instantly. It wasn't the sounds of chase that had accompanied his escape. It was the distinct sound of gunfire echoing through the tunnels, coming from the direction Morrison and his group had taken. The gunfire was intense and sustained, suggesting a protracted confrontation between Morrison's group and the criminals who had caught up with them. Hayes faced an agonizing decision. Returning to help Morrison would almost certainly mean walking into an ambush and jeopardizing the safety of Elizabeth Fairmont and the evidence they carried. But continuing meant potentially abandoning Morrison and his men to die deep in the mines. Elizabeth Fairmont solved the dilemma by making a decision that shocked Hayes. She insisted that they should continue towards the secret exit. Morrison knew the risks when he agreed to lead the group with the gold, and he had chosen the more direct path, knowing it would be more dangerous. Going back now would squander the sacrifice he was making to give Hayes's group a chance to escape with the most important evidence. The sound of gunfire continued for a few more minutes before abruptly ceased, leaving an ominous silence that echoed through the tunnels like an omen of death. Hayes knew that they had probably lost Morrison and his men, but he also understood that the only way to honor their sacrifice would be to complete the mission of exposing the criminal organization. The group has now reduced to just 3 people continued through the shaky tunnel, carrying the weight not only of the stolen documents, but also of the responsibility of being the only survivors able to bring evidence to the surface. Elizabeth Fairmont had become more than a rescued victim. She was now a crucial witness whose survival would determine whether the deaths of Charles Morrison and the others would have any meaning. The unstable tunnel that led to the secret exit stretched out before them like the throat of an ancient creature, its walls sweating damp and threatening to collapse at any moment. Hayes, Elizabeth Fairmont, and the 2 remaining men of the expedition moved forward in absolute silence, each step calculated to avoid vibration that might precipitate the collapse that everyone felt imminent. Elizabeth Fairmont had found an inner strength that defied explanation. Days of captivity, psychological torture, and the trauma of witnessing violence had not broken her resolve. If anything, the proximity of freedom seemed to have renewed his energy, as if the promise of justice to Charles was enough fuel to sustain his exhausted body through the last few miles of treacherous rock. The secret exit revealed itself to be an almost mystical portal when they finally emerged from the bowels of the mountain. After so many hours in the claustrophobic darkness of the tunnels, the evening light of the Ozarks struck them like a divine revelation. The crisp October mountain air filled their lungs with a sweetness that contrasted brutally with the heavy death-laden atmosphere they had breathed in the depths. The supply cache that the criminals kept near the exit was exactly where the map indicated. Thor horses waited in a makeshift corral, along with provisions and equipment that would allow rapid travel through the mountain trails. Hayes understood that they were using the criminal organization's own resources to escape, an irony that Charles Fairmont would have appreciated. The ride to Marshfield turned into a desperate race against time. The assault on the train was planned for October 25th, just 2 days later. If they could alert the railroad authorities in time, they could not only prevent the crime, but also capture the remaining members of the organization when they tried to execute the attack. Elizabeth Fairmont rode with a determination that impressed Hayes. Despite her debilitated physical condition, she kept pace through the steep trails of the Ozarks, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if she could see through time until the moment when justice would finally be served. The documents they carried represented more than evidence. They were the vindication of Charles and everyone who had suffered at the hands of the criminal organization. They arrived in Marshfield just as the first stars were beginning to appear in the October sky. The small town looked different after all they had experienced in the depths of the earth. The lights of the houses shone with a warmth that spoke of safety, family, and normally, concepts that seemed foreign after the subterranean horrors they had witnessed. Hayes immediately organized telegrams to authorities in Springfield, St. Louis, and Chicago, warning of the planned robbery and providing detailed evidence about the extent of the criminal operation. Elizabeth Fairmont insisted on personally writing a message to her family in Boston, informing them not only of her survival, but also of the discovery of what had really happened to Charles. The assault on the train was prevented, but not in the way Hayes had hoped. Railway authorities changed the route of the gold shipment, forcing the criminals to abandon their planned attack. More importantly, the network of corrupt informants and officials that Elizabeth Fairmont had identified was systematically exposed and eliminated over the next few months. Morrison and his men were never found. The sections of the mines where the final confrontation had taken place collapsed completely, forever sealing the tunnels that had served as theater for so many crimes. Some people in Marshfield insisted that they could still hear strange echoes coming from deep in the mountain during silent nights, as if the mine still held secrets that would never be revealed. Elizabeth Fairmont remained in Marshfield for 2 weeks after the rescue, regaining her strength and providing detailed testimony to authorities who arrived from various cities to investigate the criminal operation. When he finally left to return to Boston, he carried with him not only the evidence he had helped preserve, but also a deep understanding of the fragility of life and the importance of justice. The Ozark Inn hotel, where Elizabeth Fairmont had initially stayed, was abandoned a few years later, as the railroad changed its main route, and Marshfield began to decline in size and importance. But Thomas Whitaker, the owner, kept the room where she had stayed exactly as it was, as a kind of silent memorial to the events that had turned his small town into the setting for a drama that would echo through the years. The abandoned mines of the Ozarks remained sealed to this day, their entrances blocked by authorities, who understood that some stories are best left buried deep in the earth. But on 4 nights, when the wind blows through the Missouri mountains, locals still report hearing strange whispers coming from the fissures in the rock, as if Elizabeth and Charles Fairmont are still trying to tell their story to those who dare to listen. The case of Elizabeth Fairmont became a grim reminder that even in the small rural communities of 19th century America, macabre secrets could lurk in the shadows, waiting for investigators brave enough to descend into the depths where the truth was buried. One woman's determination to find her missing brother had exposed a criminal network that stretched across multiple states, proving that sometimes justice requires sacrifices that echo through time, like whispers in the depths of the earth. If you enjoyed this journey through the dark secrets of the Ozarks, please leave a like to support our channel. Sign up for more disturbing stories that reveal the forgotten mysteries of American history. And don't forget to comment on your own theories about what really happened in the depths of those abandoned mines.